Hello, welcome back to The Great Everything. This is Patrick. Today we're talking donuts, the term I use to collectively refer to those great lowbrow pursuits, the gut pleasures, the juiciest pop culture. All things which, although they have an immediate visceral impact, are by no means less important or meaningful than high art. And to me there's one place that embodies the notion of donut more than any other. A city that understands the importance of pleasure. The pleasure of sound, the pleasure of taste, the pleasure of flesh. That city is New Orleans, which was founded earlier this week, on the 7th of May, 1718. It's Nola's 300th birthday, so today on The Great Everything, we're celebrating New Orleans, the city of donuts.
Patrick.
Damn it, Patrick!
I am humbled.
Really just got my mind swirling, man.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for making this show. It has had a profoundly positive impact on me.
Truly life enriching.
Hello humans, welcome to The Great Everything, the world's only podcast dedicated to art, donuts and transformation. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to devote my existence to culture and philosophy, the greatest self-improvement tools of all.
Shut your raggedy ass up and sit the fuck down.
You're too much, Patrick. Honestly, you are just too much.
New Orleans is a special place to me, and I'm really excited to talk about it. Together with Rome, it's my favorite city. It brings together three of my favorite things: great music, great food, and great cocktails. It's actually the birthplace of my favorite cocktail, the Sazerac, a drink so inebriating it's said that there's no way to stick more molecules of alcohol into a single beverage. And yeah, I can attest to that. New Orleans is also where The Great Everything was born. See, I first went there with my friend Mark on a pilgrimage to taste real gumbo and shrimp étouffée, the beignets and the café au lait au Café du Monde, the pork ribs at the joint, and you know what, fuck it, the greatest donut I've ever had at District Donut Slider Brew in the Garden District. A pilgrimage to listen to live music in Frenchman Street, and to watch a Saints game. Who dat? And to sip a Sazerac made by Chris McMillian, the legendary barman whose YouTube videos from the library lounge first taught Mark and I how to make cocktails, which is still one of our favorite hobbies. Now, at that point, we were still both corporate lawyers on a winter break. And at Chris McMillian's bar, which at the time was the Kingfish on Charter Street, we discussed our plan to quit our careers and to start a blog about the importance of enjoying the truly great things in life, in culture, in food, in human thought, or as we called it, art, donuts, and transformation. And it was that conversation that gave birth to The Great Everything. New Orleans is one of those rare cities like Rome and Paris and New York with such a unique, defining, and kind of magnetic atmosphere that there's just nothing else like it. There's a feeling of freedom in the air and a sense of resilience, like the city knows it can bounce back from pretty much anything. And we know it has, time and time again. But above all, New Orleans is just plain fun. And it's not a manufactured fun. It's not fake like Vegas. You know, a great donut isn't just empty calories. There's got to be real substance, real joy there. New Orleans fun comes from a profoundly human sense that no matter what life throws at you, how you deal with it is up to you. And the people of New Orleans, they deal with it through some of the most glorious celebrations mankind has ever witnessed. There's this quote I heard once from Mark. I don't think it's his, but he's the person I heard it from. If there was no New Orleans, America would just be a bunch of free people dying of boredom. But at the end of the day, no matter the drinks, the food, the fun, to me personally, New Orleans matters because it's the home of my favorite art form, the quintessential American art form, and the distillation of everything America should stand for. Different cultures coming together, communicating, integrating into something greater than the sum of its parts, a new culture of pure expression and boundless freedom. New Orleans is, of course, the birthplace of jazz. Ted Gioia's book, The History of Jazz, opens with a vivid description of a ring shout. I want to read it to you. Quote, an elderly black man sits astride a large cylindrical drum, his repeated jabs evoking a throbbing pulsation with rapid sharp strokes. A second drummer, holding his instrument between his knees, joins in. A third black man, seated on the ground, plucks at a string instrument roughly fashioned from a calabash. A woman beats at another drum with two sticks. One voice, then another voice join in. A dance accompanies this musical give and take, on the one hand informal and spontaneous, yet on closer inspection, ritualized and precise. It is a dance of massive proportions. A dense crowd of dark bodies forms into circular groups, perhaps 500 or 600 individuals, moving in time to the pulsations of the music, some swaying gently, others aggressively stomping their feet. A number of women in the group begin chanting. The scene could be Africa. In fact, it is 19th century New Orleans. Specifically, it was an area of New Orleans known as Congo Square. Congo Square is often considered the real birthplace of jazz. Every Sunday, Congo Square would host massive ring shouts out in the open, just like the one described just now by Ted Joyer. A ring shout is a traditional form of ritual chanting and dancing with roots that stretch far back to West Africa in its history. So what's being described here is essentially an African ritual taking place in an American city. Just imagine how that must have looked to your average 19th century white bloke passing by. I mean, this is, before the internet, before gap years. Most of these people have barely even heard of Africa, let alone known anything about African culture. Yet now, in a public space in the United States of America, one of Africa's oldest cultural traditions is being shared out in the open. This is something that has never been seen in the West before, and it could have only happened in New Orleans. What makes New Orleans so special that something so unique could take place there? I think the place to start looking for clues is its history. Here's a quick outline. Founded in 1718 by the French. In 1763, the Spanish occupation happened. In 1803, you have the Louisiana Purchase. So right off the bat, we're dealing with a city that's seen three major and very diverse cultures plant roots there: the French, the Spanish, and now the Anglo-Saxon Americans. But also, consider its location. New Orleans is placed on the central highway of the South, the Mississippi. So it's a pretty major commercial hub, right? That's where all the boats with their goods and their spices and their slaves, of course, in this period, end up. And with the invention of the steamboat, which speeds up naval transport and trade tenfold, you get an explosion in goods and, of course, population. To give you an idea, in 1801 to 1807, downriver cargo was worth $5 million in goods per year. 50 years later, it was worth $200 million. So the bon temps were rolling in New Orleans for most of the 19th century. But after the Civil War came the economic downfall. New Orleans was on the losing side of the war, of course, and that meant reparations and the end of slavery, a crushing blow to the economy. On top of that, by now, railroads have already begun to replace Mississippi steamboats as the primary method for cargo transport. So suddenly, this rich, prosperous city is starting to hit on hard times. And remember, New Orleans is built in a pretty shit location. It's basically in the middle of a swamp, right? And this means frequent floods, but also stuff like mosquitoes and parasites and vermin and other gross insects abound. I remember when I first went to New Orleans, everyone would warn me about these disgusting caterpillars that lived on the trees, and they just eat the foliage until they got so fat that the leaves wouldn't hold them up anymore, wouldn't sustain their weight, and so they'd fall down. And sometimes they'd fall on people into their shirt collars, and these fat, gross caterpillars were spiky, and their spikes had venom on them. So you'd be walking down the road and suddenly you'd hear someone down the road just yelping in pain. And, well, it made for some pretty paranoid walkabouts. Anyway, all these gross insects mean you're always having to deal with pestilence, malaria, and of course yellow fever, which would periodically wipe out big chunks of the city's population. To give you an idea of what life looked like in New Orleans in the second half of the 19th century, here's some stats. In 1880, the average life expectancy for a black man in New Orleans was 36 years, and infant mortality among blacks there was 45%. Yet despite their conditions, the people of New Orleans never lose heart. As Laura Robinson says in her book, It's an Old New Orleans Custom, quote, "Through pestilence, hurricanes, and conflagrations, the people continued to sing. They sang through the long oppressive years of conquering the swampland and fortifying the town against the ever-threatening Mississippi. They are singing today. An irrepressible joie de vivre maintains the unbroken thread of music through the air." Maybe this is why the inhabitants of NOLA were, and continue to be, so fascinated with celebrations, with parades and music. It's a city that's constantly on the brink of floods or epidemics, Maybe it's a way of distancing oneself from the decay and pestilence of one's surroundings. Carnivals, feasts, Mardi Gras, whatever the reason, New Orleans is a place where people love to hear and play music. To this day, music is center stage at every parade, at every event, every funeral, and every street corner. Some of you may have heard about a New Orleans second line. These are the people who join into a parade that's led by a marching band, and that's the first line, just to enjoy the music. If it sounds familiar, it should, because this is a direct descendant of the ring shout, with the same accompaniments, the same gyrating movements, but unlike the ring shout, it's not stationary. There's a destination in mind, like a funeral, so it's not a ring, it's straightened, it's a line. There's so much music in the streets, and it's also mobile. They say that in New Orleans, if you don't go to the music will come to you. Now, there's also a seedier aspect to this cult of music and celebrations. To this day, New Orleans is known as the Big Easy, right? A place where you can go for a good time. Bourbon Street isn't just filled with music, but also with strip bars and prostitutes. Perhaps this has roots in Louisiana's origins as a French penal colony. From the start it was filled with criminals and prisoners and prostitutes. And a century or so later, New Orleans would see the rise of Storyville, one of the most famed red light districts in the whole New World, with its dance halls and its brothels. Vice and pleasure are deeply entrenched in New Orleans to this day. It kind of reminds me of a question that was published in a French magazine in the late 19th century. It was called L'Intransigeant. And the question was, if you knew that the world was going to end in the next 6 months, what would you do? New Orleans' answer is, celebrate. They say that people don't live in New Orleans because it's easy. They live there because they are incapable of living anywhere else in just the same way. Now, New Orleans' adoration for music can't just be a result of some hedonistic obsession with living in the here and now, pushing away the darkness of harsh circumstances through revelry and vice. Perhaps the biggest reason for such a unique proliferation of music there is New Orleans' absolutely astonishing cultural diversity. There's the French and the Spanish influence that I mentioned earlier, and even today this is one of the most European towns in America. The French influences are clear in the street names, in the food, in the balconies, and even the language. But perhaps an even more important contribution is the Code Noir, the code governing the ownership of slaves. The Code Noir was far more permissive than its counterparts in the Anglo-Saxon portions of America. Under the French, and later the Spanish, slaves could be freed, including in exchange for payment, of course. They could own property, and they had various other rights. This is, of course, not to say that slaves had it easy. I'm not Kanye West. But it is true that Catholic cultures did seem to be far more tolerant in accepting, quote, unorthodox social hybrids than its Anglo-Saxon Puritan counterparts. This, let's call it tolerance of blurring the lines, may have led to the sanctioning of Congo Square as an official place for slaves to congregate socially. The Congo Square ring shouts simply couldn't have happened in the far less tolerant Texas or Kentucky or Mississippi. This environment may have also led to another unique element in New Orleans culture, the rise of its Creole community. The Creoles were free peoples of color, usually mixed-race descendants of Europeans and their black slaves and their black mistresses and wives. The Creoles enjoyed many privileges of white folk at the time, including property rights and high education, and they clung fiercely to their social status. They identified with white culture far more than they identified with the slaves, and they typically had French or Spanish names and spoke mainly in French. One important point to note about the Creoles is that in music, they tended to have classical training. Many of them were virtuoso musicians who would play in the city's many orchestras or in the opera house. So for a long time, they were unlike any other African Americans anywhere in the US. But with the advent of Jim Crow laws and segregation, the Creoles lost their special privileges and suddenly found themselves reclassified just as, to use a historical term, quote, Negroes. Now they were suddenly unable to interact with whites the same way they had previously done, including playing in the mixed-race orchestras of the time, so instead they had to play their music with fellow black folk. And in doing so, they started bringing that classical education into the black sides of town. Finally, New Orleans had the white immigrants, not just from Protestant America, but also from Europe. Irish, German, Italians. These people, they mingled with the black and Creole populations to create this rich gumbo, unlike anything else in America or the world. In the mid-late 19th century, New Orleans was about as cosmopolitan as any city in America. So you have this unprecedented mingling of white European and black African people and cultures coming together unlike anywhere before in America or even the world, frankly. So these were the elements that came together in New Orleans, the original melting pot, to give rise to America's true art form, and in my view, its greatest cultural contribution to the world so far. And perhaps it's a lesson that we can learn today. In an age of growing divisions and increasing polarization and tribalism, in an age where people are trying to build walls and throwing bombs at each other instead of reaching out and coming together, perhaps we should look at the example of New Orleans. Not a perfect example by any means. We're still talking about a place that had slavery a century and a half ago. But its example is one of cultures coming together to create something new, something unique, and something beautiful. If they could do that in 19th century New Orleans, in a globalized world where we have direct access to the ideas and the stories and the cultures of 7 billion people, what can we come up with? I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Great Everything, and if you like the show, there's a few ways you can help out. You can leave a review on iTunes or anywhere else you listen to this podcast, or you can share it, embed it, talk about it on your podcast or write a blog about it, or you could just add me on the various Twitters and Instagrams out there. But if you want to be a part of the conversation, you can call in using Anchor, or you can look up The Great Everything on Facebook. I have a discussion group there where people talk about literally everything, from ethics to politics to Marvel movies. So if that's your thing, check it out. I hope I see you again here, there, or anywhere else, frankly. Until then, grazie e arrivederci.
Well, arrivederci, Luigi.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.